Alan, we're here at the wastewater treatment works here in Mountfield, and I know this particular place has special significance for you. Do you want to share with us why so?
Well, I've driven past this place, I suppose, for the last 40 years, up and down the road, and maybe within 3 months, just after the Provisional IRA pulled up at this entrance. Now, this whole thing has all changed dramatically at that point, but they pulled up at this entrance, got out of their car and walked in through the gate and called out my father's name, Tommy Irwin, as far as I can, and shot him at close range. So that's 40 years now, coming on the 26th of March 1986 that happened. And so that's how this, I suppose, being here now on the 40th anniversary is a key thing that I just felt I needed to do. As I said, about 3 months afterwards, I came past this gate on my way to an orange service up in Mountfield Parish Church, and I suppose I did that annually each year as a kind of my way of paying tribute to him, even though I wasn't here. But this is the first time I've actually stopped at the entrance in the last 40 years in coming here, you know.
And Alan, your daddy obviously worked here. Do you want to give us a little sense of what it was exactly that he was doing, as much as you can understand?
Well, he did quite a run of treatment works right across here, and he would have came from here, from Carrickmore treatment works, Loch McGrory, then here to Mountfield, and at that stage there was really only a large tank, treatment tank there, and a bigger one there. There was very little else. This has all dramatically changed in this last year or two from what it was at that point, and he would have really been down a manhole service in the manhole just to make sure that things was functioning and things was moving, and sometimes they would have had to turn valves or change valves just to make the thing function in the way that it needed. So apparently he was seemingly down one of those service manholes when they called out his name, you know, and shot him. And to be, you know, there was nothing heroic in what they did, not one iota, because to walk in broad daylight on a busy road not that far away and shoot somebody, unarmed person with no way of defence, there's nothing heroic in that, nothing whatsoever. To me, that's all the hallmarks of someone who's driven by fear, you know, cowards, just driven by pure fear of anything that has any semblance of a British connection to it, and that's how it is. And to be honest, there's no glory in it either, and those who continue to glorify acts of terrorism and violence, they just bring shame on themselves. You know, it's a shameful act.
And Alan, it strikes me as well that this would have been, you know, quite tough physical work, especially in, you know, the wintry sort of months. But your daddy also obviously fulfilled the role of a part-time UDR soldier, so it can only but imagine he needed to be very good with his timekeeping in order to get everything done, and it wouldn't have been simple either within the home, I'm quite guessing, without your daddy there a lot of the time.
No, it wasn't. When at that time the DOE was using you had to be at a certain place at a certain time and do certain things at a certain time, so all that had to be done. And when Dad was on the part-time UDR, he was out at night, so he would always have been into work the next day on time. He would have never have left it late, because that would always have brought attention to it. And I know some people said, why wasn't he carrying a PPE, but he was always afraid of dropping it into maybe a manhole or into a tank and not being able to retrieve it, or being overpowered by those that were working with him. And that's one thing he could never have lived with, if they used it on him and then would use it on someone else. So it was quite difficult. I know the morning that Dad went to work, you know, he had been told the evening before, from my memory, that there was a threat on the lives of security personnel, and by his way of talking, that he was one of those. He always assumed it would be Carrickmore because they spent an hour here, and then it came here. And I think I suppose for us, just having that conversation around the table that morning about what would need to be done or what would have to be done, but it hasn't been easy, and there's no way of saying it has been easy, since it's been difficult, and it's been a test of wills at times, and there's no doubt your life changes, and not just Mum's life, but the entire family life changes. And I suppose then there was no real counselling, there was nothing in those early years. You got on with it, you dealt with it yourself.
Yeah. And Alan, of course, the extended family, you had already, in many ways, maybe in a less direct but an indirect way, had suffered it as well with your uncle Fred, only a matter of 7 years earlier, isn't that right?
Just 7 years in October 79, yeah. But we did, and Fred was very much... Fred and Dad, whilst there was a difference in their ages, were very close, and I know my mum and my late aunt, Fred's wife, were always very close over those. So, once a fortnight, he'd have been in our house or we'd have been in their house, so we were always very close to that road, and that did have a drastic effect, not just on us as nephews, but on my father too. Like, my father really struggled with that, and he had to go at that time till clear out the car immediately afterwards and identify the body, and that always stuck with them, and that, you're left with that and he was trying to be supportive to her and to them, the family, as best you can, because you don't understand what they're going through. You just have your own emotions and you're almost afraid to speak about it or talk about it, and that's not the helpful thing at those times.
And Alan, something else that strikes me too is this issue of those whom carried out that heinous murder would suggest that this was war, but yet a man was murdered when he was at his place of work carrying out a service on behalf of the full community.
Yeah.
There was no distinction in terms of this work with whom the beneficiaries were, and that must also be very, very difficult to understand and to comprehend as you were growing up, how that could be.
There's no doubt, one thing I need to be very clear on, this was no war. This is just a dirty sectarian campaign of sadistic murders that had no thought or care. I just think about it in the sense that Dad, worked with everybody, dealt with everybody. We were brought up to respect everybody. We may have differences, whether those differences were religious or political, so be it. You just got on with it, And what really galls me, I suppose, or really sickens me to the pit of my stomach is when I hear, terrorists and even their families claiming that their human rights have been violated, and I'm saying, well, what about my father's human rights and my uncle and so many countless others that weren't even given an opportunity to life, that gunned down and unarmed, and the many bombs that they planted in darkness and behind balaclavas and hedges and ditches to do that. Like, what about their human rights? Men, women and children, they knew rightly what they were doing. And it was just to destroy life and to pursue some twisted mythological, historical narrative that had no basis in truth.
And Alan, just finally, obviously we're very conscious that milestone anniversary is almost upon you, and there will be a seminar held in the coming days where obviously you along with others will share a panel and discuss these issues at large. How are you feeling as that time comes up? Have you any sort of anxious feelings, or how do you hope that evening would go?
I suppose in some ways, whilst I know it's planned and we're working towards it, I haven't allowed my mind to really function much on it. I have some notes made and thing, and I suppose I'm hoping that and praying that we're able to fill the hall. That is my hope, in one way, and I suppose it won't be until maybe the evening in question that all of those emotions will flood again, just as if it was only yesterday, because in as much as you get on and you live your life, the trauma of the past is still there, and the lack of no justice and no real will for political justice, justice even from politics. The good side is the thing as well. So, yeah, I'm hoping that there's a good number, and I'm hoping that it's an opportunity for those to hear and others to share their experiences, but also to look at where we go from here. How do we promote the truth, and how do we counter the narrative that's been done? And that's not just down to SAF or down to individuals like myself and others. It's down to every individual, every person, church leader. Every individual needs to counter the narrative and say, no, that's not right, that's all lies. And that needs to be done, because the more the world and our society accepts the lie, then they believe it is the truth when it's far from it.
Oh, look at it. I could just say that your daddy, to think that he could be this close in terms of distance whenever he was working at his thing, and I'm quite sure that if he saw who you've grown into today in terms of faith and everything that you stand for and standing by what the integrity of the life that he lived, it would make him very proud. So you should know that as well, that as difficult as those years have been, you've turned out well.
They have been challenging, there's no doubt. I suppose I've spent time, as the man says, in the wilderness for a while, as anyone else. And I suppose it was Dad who planted the seed of the ministry way back when I was 13 or 14, I suppose. And that seed stuck, you know. It took me a while to get there.
On behalf of 6 Mile Cross District Royal Arch Purple Chapter, I'd like to welcome everyone along tonight. It's good to see the hall so well filled out. I'd like to thank LOL 1277 for the use of their hall tonight. Good sized hall and a good car park, so thank you to the men of 1277. The panel tonight will be Ben Lowry, editor of the newsletter, and he will be chairing the meeting. Claire Hayes, sister of Alan Radford, who was murdered in the Omagh bomb, will also be speaking, and Jennifer Jordan, who had 6 family members murdered by the Provisional IRA in South Armagh and South Down, and also Canon the Reverend Alan Irwin, who had his dad and his uncle murdered. And those who are not familiar with the hall, you'll see the plaques in the hall here, just behind Alan here, of his father and his uncle. And thanks to Kenny also, Kenny Donaldson put a lot of work into this event, the staff director, so thank you, Kenny, for that. Just a few words before I hand over to Alan. Alan put a lot of work into this tonight, and he deserves a lot of credit, and I'm sure it wasn't easy for him, but it's nice that we're able to do something for the family and something for Alan's family as well. Alan's father was murdered on the 26th of March 1986, just coming up now in 40 years. And they were left with, Mrs. Irwin was left with a family of 5 young children. So it just shows you these boys that were out murdering people, they didn't give a stuff about anybody else or what the family was left with, the whole mess that was left behind. Alan's father worked hard, served in UDR to help just for the country, and he was murdered at his place of work up near Mountfield. We, as a Royal Arch Purple District, erected a memorial stone in 1997, and we have all the members of the security forces and also civilians in the area who were murdered around the 6 Mile Cross area. We hold a service every year at the end of October, and this is primarily for the family, or for the families I should say. So it's nice to be able to do this, for the Royal Arch Purple to be able to do this. The stone was erected for that reason, and it's nice to have this service. So to the ladies also of the Clough and Pipe Band, and also to the members of the Royal Arch Purple who will be helping with tea, so please don't be rushing away, there's tea afterwards. And to all who helped in any way, be it car parking, whatever, thank you very much. And we'll hand over to Alan now. Thank you.
Thank you, Irwin, for that. And I just want to say a big welcome to each and every one of you to come along tonight. A number of individuals had asked me, was I going to do anything for Dad's 40th anniversary, and I had indicated I probably wouldn't be doing anything because, as Irwin has said, we have the annual service every year from 1997 where we remember all of our victims who were murdered by the terrorists, from those born in the area and those who died while serving in the area, both civilian and security, and that's held every year. So we remember all of the significant anniversaries at that. But I suppose as the Captain Diglan, and I've been at a number of these events of late, not just in my own locality but elsewhere, and then I said to Ken, I'm going to do anything, we'd have some form of seminar and an opportunity just to hear from different speakers, not intending to be one of those speakers, I might add. But I'm delighted that that Jennifer and Claire have agreed to come along and be very much a part of this tonight. But before we do, we want to acknowledge all of those that are on the memorial stone at Clougharney, and that's not taken out those who, the soldiers on the Ballygolly Road, are very much a part of our district, but the memorial's still there and still able to be there. But we recognise those, and we're going to play a little montage now, and that will indicate all those that we remember in our locality once a year.
In marking the 40th anniversary since the brutal murder of Private Thomas Irwin on the 26th of March 1986, this seminar has been organised in Clougharney Orange Hall, a collaboration between 6 Mile Cross District and SAFE, the Victims Group. The purpose of tonight's seminar is to examine the human costs of terrorism and violence, and aptly the seminar is titled Wounds That Speak. Across 6 Mile Cross District, there are remembered 22 innocents who were murdered as a consequence of Provisional IRA terrorism. And in beginning this production, we give honour to their memory. Constable William Raymond Wiley, murdered on the 27th of February 1973, aged 25 years. Fatally shot in a gun battle when ambushed by Provisional IRA terrorist gunmen. The attack occurred at Cranagh Bridge, Ahagallen, near Lurgan, County Armagh. He was posthumously awarded the Queen's Police Medal for gallantry. Reserve Constable Ronald Macaulay was injured in the same incident and died a month later. Reserve Constable Joseph James Clements, murdered on the 16th of November 1975, aged 48 years. Joseph was married with 2 children, a school principal and a reserve RUCGC police officer, who was fatally injured the previous day by a Provisional IRA landmine near 6 Mile Cross. He had been attending a crime scene in the fulfilment of his duties. Corporal William McKee, 6 UDR, murdered on the 14th of April 1978, aged 61 years. He was ambushed and shot by 2 women and a man while driving a school bus near Omagh. Although wounded, he managed to control the bus and accelerate away, but his Provisional IRA attackers followed him in a hijacked car and caught up with him at a crossroads 3 miles away. He was shot again. He dragged himself onto the road before he collapsed and died from his injuries. He was off duty and a widower at the time of his murder. Reserve Constable Howard George Donachie, murdered on the 11th of September 1978, aged 24 years. Howard was single, a post office engineer and a reserve RUC GC police officer who was from Lochmacrory Road, Omagh. Howard died in his mother's arms after he was shot by the Provisional IRA. He was working on a bungalow that he was having built in anticipation of his forthcoming wedding in the June of that year, when he was mercilessly murdered by the Provisional IRA. Private John Graham, 6 UDR. John was murdered on the 25th of April 1979, aged 55 years. He was shot by the Provisional IRA whilst driving his lorry at Seskinore, County Tyrone, on his regular tour of local farms collecting milk. A hard-working man, he was off duty and married at the time of his cruel murder. Corporal Frederick Houston Irwin, 8 UDR, murdered on the 30th of October 1979, aged 43 years. Shot by the Provisional IRA as he drove to his work. He had previously received death threats from the Provisional IRA and had been varying his route, but could not avoid the last stretch. His brother Thomas was a soldier in the regiment and was also murdered by the Provisional IRA in 1986. He was off duty and married at the time of his murder. Reserve Constable Christopher Kyle, murdered on the 17th of June 1981, aged 25 years. Christopher was single. He was a motor mechanic and a reserve RUC GC police officer who was from Mullislin, Berra, near Carrickmore. Christopher was found by his father fatally wounded and slumped over the steering wheel of his car. He was driving home around 5:35 p.m. from work when the attack occurred. Constable John Smith, aged 34 years, murdered on the 2nd of August 1981. John was married with 3 children and an RUC GC police officer. He was murdered when a Provisional IRA landmine exploded under the car he was travelling near Lochmacrory. John was from Omagh. He had been in the RUC GC since 1968 and had 3 children aged between 1 and 5 years old. In the same incident, Constable Andrew Alfred Woods was also murdered. Alfred, better known as Alfie, was married with 6 children and was an RUC GC police officer. He was also from Omagh and had joined the RUC GC in 1970. Cruelly, less than a year later, his widow also passed away of a broken heart. Detective Constable Gary Mervyn Ewing, murdered on the 9th of November 1982, aged 31 years. Gary was from Enniskillen. He was born on the 3rd of September 1951 and had 2 brothers and 1 sister. He joined the RUC George Cross and was a special branch detective constable stationed in Enniskillen. He was 31 years old, married and a father of 2 young daughters. He was attending a class at Lakeland Form Enniskillen. He was giving a lift home to Helen Woodhouse who had also attended the class and was a family friend and babysitter. As they drove away, a bomb exploded under the car, murdering them both. The following 4 soldiers, who will be referenced, were murdered when a 600-pound bomb exploded near Ballygawley. The bomb exploded beneath the Land Rover they were travelling in, the last of 5 vehicles on their way from Omagh to Ballykinler for a training exercise. Corporal Thomas Horan, 6 UDR, murdered 13th of July 1983, aged 24 years. He was married at the time of his murder and lived in Sion Mills with his wife and their young child. Tommy was viewed to be a dedicated soldier and was respected among his colleagues and beyond the regimental family. Private John Roxburgh, 6 UDR, murdered on the 13th of July 1983, aged 19 years. He was single at the time of his murder. John had a keen interest in football and regularly played the sport as a hobby. He was also a devoted member of Omagh Protestant Boys Flute Band. He was committed and frequently attended practices and parades. John played the flute. Private Ronnie Alexander, 6 UDR, murdered on the 13th of July 1983, aged 19 years. He was single at the point of his murder. Ronnie was an outgoing young man and was very sociable. He also had a great interest in motorbikes and had his own Honda 404, which he loved. Private Ozzie Neely, 6 UDR, murdered on the 13th of July 1983, aged 20 years. He was married at the time of his murder with 1 child. Ozzie had a great love for swimming. He would regularly go to his local swimming pool, so much so that family members recall how he often had cold sores due to constant exposure to the chlorine in the pool. Malvern Moffat, civilian, murdered on the 27th of June 1983, aged 36 years. Malvern was married with 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. He was a hedge cutting contractor and was murdered while at his work near Omagh. Malvern's body was found lying in his tractor in a laneway at Striff Road near Omagh, where he had been shot in the back by 2 Provisional IRA gunmen. He had only driven a short distance from where he had left his car before being ambushed. Constable Paul Gabriel Marion Clark, murdered on the 12th of November 1983, aged 29 years. Paul was married with 3 children and was an RUC GC police officer, murdered in a Provisional IRA mortar attack on Carrickmore RUC GC station. He and 5 colleagues were in a prefabricated hut at the time of the attack, and all officers were injured and extensive damage was caused to the base. Detective Women's Constable Ivy Winifred Kelly, murdered on the 28th of February 1985, aged 29 years. Ivy Kelly, née Fenton, was one of 9 members of the RUC George Cross who were murdered when the Provisional IRA launched a mortar attack on Newry Police Station on the 28th of February 1985. She was based in Lurgan. Ivy was an accomplished sportswoman, a member of the police ladies hockey team. She was from County Tyrone. Private Thomas Irwin, 6 UDR, murdered on the 26th of March 1986, aged 52 years. Thomas was shot dead by the Provisional IRA as he worked at a sewage plant at Mountfield near Omagh. The unmasked gunman shot at close range before being driven off by an accomplice. Thomas' brother Corporal Frederick Irwin was shot dead by the Provisional IRA at his work in 1979. He too was off duty and married at the time of his murder. John Kyle, civilian, murdered on the 30th of July 1986, aged 40 years. John was a civilian, married and quarry owner who was from Oakland Court, Omagh. He was shot by the Provisional IRA in a bar in Greencastle. The terror organisation claimed that John was supplying building supplies to the security forces. Captain Ivan Anderson, 6 UDR, murdered on the 21st of May 1987, aged 47 years. Ivan was ambushed by the Provisional IRA near his home at Truney, near Carrickmore. His car careered out of control and after a few hundred yards crashed on an isolated road as he travelled home from his local primary school to which he was principal. The RUCGC at first thought they were attending the scene of an accident. He was off duty and single at the point of his murder. On the day of his funeral, the pupils of that school formed a guard of honour. Women's Constable Colleen Linda McMurray, murdered 28th of March 1992, aged 34 years. Colleen was from 6 Mile Cross and was an RUCGC constable. Colleen was travelling in a patrol car along Merchants Quay, Newry, when a horizontally fired Provisional IRA Mark 12 mortar hit the passenger side of the car. The mortar had been hidden in a parked car and was fired through a hole in a metal panel. Frederick Anthony, civilian, murdered on the 13th of May 1994, aged 38 years. Frederick was an RUCGC station cleaner, murdered by a terrorist undercar bomb that exploded as he drove along Hill Street, Lurgan in County Armagh. These 22 names and circumstances which have just been relayed are a reminder of the gravity of the terror which struck across 6 Mile Cross district, a relatively small piece of geography. And the people of this area have never ceased to remember. Tonight's event is the latest in a long testimony of remembrance.
Just as we have watched that, and I'm sure has stirred a lot of memories, I want to read a few verses from Psalm 37. Do not fret because of evildoers, nor be envious of the workers of iniquity, for they shall soon be cut down like the grass and wither as the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good, dwell in the land and feed in his faithfulness. Delight yourself also in the Lord, and he shall give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord, trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. He shall bring forth your righteousness as the light and your justice as the noonday. Rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret because of him who prospers in his way, because of the man who brings wicked schemes to pass. Cease from anger and forsake wrath. Do not fret, it only causes harm. For evildoers shall be cut off, but those who wait on the Lord, they shall inherit the earth. Can I ask you just to stand for a minute's silence just? Heavenly Father, you are a faithful and a loving God, a God who comforts us in our loss, and a God whom we know will speak into the memories that have been stirred and the hurts that we still feel. In this our time of remembrance, Lord, we seek to continue to pursue the path of peace in him who is the Prince of Peace, that we may carry forward that torch of remembrance, that torch of truth, that the legacy of our past will never be forgotten in our present or in our future. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. You can be seated. I'm going to hand over now to Ben here. He'll take charge of the rest.
Okay.
No pressure.
No, okay. Thank you for having me. It's very good to see a large crowd here tonight. And I had no hesitation when I was asked to come along in doing this. I think Kenny and Canon Irwin want me to say a few words about legacy at the start, before we hear from the victims. And I probably would, let me explain fairly briefly why, as editor of the newsletter, we've taken an interest in legacy and why I personally have taken an interest in legacy. Unlike very many people in this room, I grew up in North Down, long way from trouble. There was very little violence, and it was a point of pride when we went abroad on a holiday and you saw people and say, oh, Northern Ireland's very normal and all of that kind of thing. And Northern Ireland has become much more normal, and it's very good to see. But as I got older, my teenage view of the Troubles improved. I mean, as it happens, of my various ancestry, my mum's side, I'm a Ferguson from Fermanagh. And I didn't know very much about Fermanagh, and didn't know about the killing fields, and didn't know the statistics, by the way, until relatively recently, about 10 years ago, when Kenny told me the story of Fermanagh, which is a story of total non-retaliation. I think it's 114 dead, that kind of figure. About 100 killed by Provisional IRA terrorists. And there's a couple of killings by soldiers, and there's a few loyalist killings and so on. But essentially it is a story of a minority community being picked off in a sectarian onslaught and not retaliating. And this kind of thing, although I didn't know that statistic until 10 years ago, began to come onto my radar in the 1990s. And I'll just give you two of many examples where I started to realize what was happening on legacy and what a scandal it is and what a serious, serious problem it is. And the two examples I'm going to give are this. One was an interview with a South African journalist who had travelled to Northern Ireland. He was white, and he had talked to Martin McGuinness, and Martin McGuinness had whined about how they would be driven up to be interrogated in the Northwest, and this was to sort of make suspects disorientated. And the South African journalist, beginning to see through the IRA self-pity and rot, said, wow, in South Africa you talked or you died. And over the 30 years since I read that, I've seen this distortion of a gentle response, one of the most gentle responses in the world to terrorism. And I specify IRA terrorism not because I don't think there was loyalist terrorists, not because I don't think that there were other terrorists, because the IRA were the principal terrorists, by far the largest group. Republican terrorists killed 60% of the dead. But it's also not just that, it's specifically that the IRA are leading the campaign to distort history of what happened, and they're doing it very successfully. The other story was, I was on a plane in 1992, Easter, coming home from university, and I happened to be beside a woman who was from Northern Ireland. I don't know to this day who she was, but she had left Northern Ireland and she'd become a headmistress in England. And her sons were obviously very academic. She said they wanted to go to Oxford and Cambridge and study law and go into unionist politics, because although they were living in England, they had grown up in Northern Ireland. And then when Edgar Graham was murdered, they lost all interest, never went in, family never came back. So I don't know how many of you know who Edgar Graham was. I mean, I was only 11 when he was killed, so I don't remember it. But he was murdered as an academic and a unionist barrister in Queen's University. He was shot in the head, age 29, a rising star of unionism. And that was pure terrorism. That was terror, okay? Think about that. That was terror. And that was saying to bright young students, you go down this route, you will end up dead. Now, I don't need to tell you about terror, because as I say, I didn't really grow up around it, you did. So that was a sort of crystallizing moment. And then, just another couple of points I'd make here. In 2001, I was a journalist at the Belfast Telegraph. I was still in my 20s. And I covered the Weston Park, I think it was called, talks. And I saw what was happening. They agreed inquiries into collusion and Pat Finucane and so on. And by then I'd begun to realize what I call the collusion lie. Okay, so at the heart of this imbalance is the collusion lie. It's the idea that there was systemic cooperation between the UK security forces and loyalist terrorists. And the reason that I say that it was a lie, of 1,100 people murdered by loyalist terrorists, most of them were Catholic shot for being Catholic. Of those who were Republican paramilitaries, by some accounts, there's different lists and we can't be sure, less than 50 were Republicans. So think about this. If the nationalist, and it is a nationalist belief, I hate to talk in tribal terms like this, but that's what it is. If the nationalist belief that there was widespread collusion is right, then why did loyalist terrorists kill Catholics, and why did they not kill IRA men? And the reason that they didn't kill IRA men is very clear. They didn't have intelligence. There wasn't collusion. I'm not saying there were no instances of it ever. I'm not saying that it was perfect. I'm not saying that there weren't illegal killings and things like that. I'm talking about the thrust of it. So I saw that happening in Weston Park. I also did a major feature in Weston Park about the plan to give an amnesty to on the runs. And my goodness, where that has gone. So that fell off the radar. They couldn't get it through. We later found out that Tony Blair and his government, in the determination to appease the IRA, which is the unrelenting feature of this, it just never goes away, the appeasement of the IRA. In the 2001 talks, they didn't get their amnesty for on the runs, and they got a secret scheme later, and there's a de facto amnesty. And it gets worse and worse and worse. I mean, we had the Adams trial, obviously, recently. And it seems to me that there is essentially never going to be any uncovering or justice, and I'd hate to be bleak about this, unless it is a finding against the state, unless it is a finding of collusion, unless it is a finding against unionists, essentially. Essentially, this is the lie. The lie is that unionists and the British state were a murderous coalition, when the truth is the very opposite. I mean, Fermanagh is an extreme example of no retaliation. But when you get west of Northern Ireland, it's an overwhelming onslaught. I mean, for example, last two things I'd say. Consider 1972, when IRA leaders, including Martin McGuinness, are flown to London to talk with the government. And they don't get their way in the summer. And what do they do when they don't get their way? They blew up Belfast city centre. Now, incidentally, a few months before, they blew up the newsletter. And I worked at the Belfast Telegraph. A few years later, they blew up the Belfast Telegraph. So first of all, murdering newspapers, attack on democracy. But the IRA I could talk all night about that, but I don't have time. But the IRA don't get their way when they are given an audience at the highest levels of the UK government, and they blew up Belfast. What would Israel do? What would the United States do? What would lots of countries do? They would have taken them out with a rocket. They would have killed them with a rocket. Okay, we gave you a chance, we flew you over for talks, and then you blew up the centre and you massacred people, and we know who you were and we know who did, and they did it. Now, I'm not saying, please don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying they should have taken them out with a rocket. I'm saying that they didn't do anything like that, and yet, quite incredibly, they thought that if they did, the UK governments, if they did something like that, it would make things worse, and there's a very plausible argument that that's true. But having not done anything like that, we're now having truth turned on its head, the story to young people told that they effectively did do that. My last point, the chronic, ongoing, unforgivable, institutional weakness towards the IRA is evident in the following fact. Ireland is suing the UK. It's just incredible. Not even that many people know that. It should be on the news every night. It's suing the UK because of the Tory government's amnesty plan. Again, it would take too long to explain the ins and outs of it. But the UK won't even push back. So one of the things I recommended in my role as a commentator and somewhat public figure and somebody who has a bit of a voice, I said, well, why don't we have an inquiry into the Irish refusals to extradite terrorists? I mean, 103 out of 110 requests for over 30 years are turned down, as a consequence of which IRA terrorists know they can flee across the border, know they can plot their next attack on the son of a farmer, or whatever it is. And we don't even have pushback on that. And my last thought is Keir Starmer was in town recently, 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, and I asked him about that. And I said, Prime Minister, I tried to be respectful, the Irish Republic, where you're heading in a few hours, he was going to a summit, is suing the country of which you're Prime Minister. I'm not aware of you having criticised this, and I genuinely was worried that he would turn around and say, oh, I did criticise it, and, whatever date, and I'd missed it. But he didn't say that. He didn't answer my question. He just was interested in going to the south and having good relations. So that's why I'm interested in legacy. That's why I think it's exceedingly important. That's why I am very pleased to do stories with Kenny and Seth, and particularly Canon Irwin, your story, which is illustrates what I'm talking about, terror. We've worked with you before. You wrote in our Legacy Scandal series. You've written fantastic letters and other contributions to the paper. So that's my interest. And I am going to now ask the panel to speak, starting with Jennifer Jordan. We met recently at King's Mill, and again I was struck. I hadn't been to the King's Mill site. I knew all about it, I'd read about it, we've covered it for years, but it's one of the sites I hadn't been to. And that's precisely what we're talking about. And I was really struck when I interviewed you of the bravery of living down there and staying there after the murder of her father, Clifford Dundee, which was, Jennifer, one of 6 family members murdered by the Provisional IRA in South Armagh and South Down. And the South Down thing, again, when I get older, having grown up in North Down, when you're a kid, that's a long way away. And now I realise how close all these things were. Jennifer.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share my story here tonight. I know it may not be a nice one, but nevertheless, I think it should be told. I live in Lisnaskea at the moment, but I originally came from King's Mills in South Armagh, which was known as Bandit Country. That might help you to realise what type of a place it was. My dad was Clifford Lundy. He was 62 years of age when he was murdered. He was born in County Armagh on the 20th of July 1916. He had 1 brother and 6 sisters. One of his sisters still survives. She's in her 98th year. He married my mum Jeannie in 1939, and they had 2 sons, both of whom died as toddlers, and then myself. That wasn't a good start to married life for them. In his early years, he worked on farms, but was later employed as a lorry driver for Haldane Shields Limited, builders merchants in Newry. In his spare time, he enjoyed doing mechanical work on cars, lorries, and his motorbike. He loved his motorbike and enjoyed going to watch the races. He was on the Home Guard, the USC, the UDR, which he retired from in 1978 as a corporal. On the 2nd of January 1980, he was arriving home from work. It was his first day back after the Christmas holidays. He got out of his car and he was shot in the back by IRA terrorists. Now that wasn't exactly a happy new year for us. And he was an unarmed man. So it takes brave heroes to shoot down an unarmed man in the back. Yet these heroes are being glorified today. 4 bullets went through his body, resulting in a number of horrific injuries. They lacerated and fractured his spine, his lungs, and his heart. That's what my mum and I were left to cope with. We were in an isolated area, and I will never forget that sound of gunfire. This deed was carried out just beside our church at King's Mills, which was a short distance from the minibus massacre of 10 innocent men 4 years previously. And my father actually was buried on the 4th anniversary of the King's Mill massacre. Now, when that happened, I got into a bit of a state. Shock just came upon me. My legs began to shake and I just was like wobbling like a jelly. And I knew I had to go and get help. And I didn't know where to turn. And suddenly I thought, I'm going to ask God for help, which I did. And you know, he helped me in a wonderful way. There was a calm blanket of warmth and ease came down from heaven over me, and it just steadied my whole body right down. Then I was able to get myself together and go and get the keys of Kingsmill Primary School in which my mum worked to telephone the police, because we had no telephone at that time. So I was able to do that and phone the police, and they were with us quite quickly, within 10 minutes, which was quite good. Another wee thing that happened, the helper on his lorry, on my father's lorry, he actually gathered information about my father and passed it on to the IRA. And you know, my mum often sent extra sandwiches in the lunchbox for the helpers. And that's the thanks that everybody got. I think that was very sad. You're with someone every day on the lorry helping, yet you're working behind backs to make sure that they're going to lose their life. How sad is that? Then I move on to my first uncle on the 30th of August in 1975. Bertie had been helping an elderly farmer. He was reversing his car out from the farmhouse just above White Cross when the terrorists were waiting. They shot him in the head, they dragged him from the car and left him to die on the road. And then they took his car. 3 months later, my second uncle, Johnny Bell, he was 57, on the 6th of November, Johnny was driving home from work into his laneway at Ballymire when the terrorists struck his car. It was riddled with bullets and it crashed down into the drain. Now, some of the bullets went into his back and out through his abdomen, causing horrific injuries. And just bear in mind, those 2 men were murdered within 3 months of each other. So we really hadn't got over the shock. We could hardly even believe the first man had been murdered. And yet we were plunged into a second murder 3 months later. Then I go back to my extended family. On the 8th of March 1972, Joseph Jardine, he was 43. He was my dad's cousin's husband, and he was murdered at his place of work. He was a veterinary officer for the Department of Agriculture and was inspecting cattle at Middletown when the terrorists drove up in a car. They opened fire, and Joseph was hit at least 16 times. Then on the 18th of May 1984, Trevor Elliott, who was 29, my cousin's husband, and another colleague were killed instantly in a £1,000 bomb explosion at Camlock. And on the 15th of February, Alan Johnson, who was 23, my mum's cousin's son, he was going to his work. He had his toolbox in one hand and his lunchbox in the other. As he walked towards the main building in Kilkeel, a gunman was waiting and fired at least 5 shots into his head and his chest. Now, Alan had been working for this firm. He had been working somewhere else for a couple of months, and that was his first day back into the main base in Kilkeel. So obviously they had been doing their homework very well and had got inside help when they knew he was back on that particular day. Now, all of the above were decent, innocent, hard-working men who would have helped everyone in the community. That was quite a lot for one family to cope with 6 members. But our faith helped my mum and I thank God for the grace that He gave me and my mother to cope with all the sorrow we had to go through. Only for God, I don't know where we would have been. On this panel tonight, there are 3 of us. And through that 3, we have lost 9 family members. That's just out from 3 families, 9 members have been lost. And also I have a friend in Lisbelow who's photographed there. She lost 4 of her family, 3 brothers and a sister as well. So if you add up that total, that was the Graham brothers. If you add that total, that's 13 altogether from 4 families. That's quite horrific statistics. All these murders were premeditated. They were planned with local knowledge. Now, how do we keep our loved ones' memories alive? We tell our stories like what we're doing tonight, so that people know exactly what happened, how we had to live, what we had to live with, and the constant threat of terrorism. And also the memorial quilts here are an excellent way to get the truth across. Every patch represents a life cruelly taken. And we have to thank SAFE for doing that. And also holding memorial services in remembrance of our loved ones. I also think maybe something like a library of audio tapes which tell our story. And it would also be good if a book of all the stories could be produced. But I know that that would be a mighty task, but still, it's worth thinking about. Now, I want to touch a wee bit on terrorist glorification. Innocent victims and survivors today seem to be trampled upon. It seems as if we don't matter. In August 2024, an event was held in the Burndale Hotel in Newcastle, commemorating the life of an IRA man, Paul McGorrian, who was involved in ambushes and attacks on security forces. Also in October, in the Marketplace Theatre in Armagh, this was a council-run facility, the life story of a hunger striker, Martin Herson, was shown. Now, I have a dwelling house in County Armagh and I pay my rates. And part of my rates go towards arts and theatre. So in all reality, part of my money is going towards a theatre that allows such programmes to be shown, which again is worth thinking about. Now, in that same city in Armagh, there is a memorial wall with over 320 names of men in the Armagh area, all innocent men who were murdered by these 2 men's organisations. And this story was also shown at the waterfront in Belfast in March 2025. All of the above is further insult and injury to innocent victims. Both of these men choose to be in that evil organisation. My family members had no choice. Their lives were taken cruelly from them. Now, in this year, 2026, I understand that balaclavas and scarves with up the Ra are being sold to children. Again, further glorification of terrorism. We need to keep telling our stories to get our youth educated with the truth of what happened. I asked the question, who is standing up to help the innocent victims to counteract all of these things? Why is there not pressure being put on council-run facilities, etc., to stop these terrorist events happening? We need help from our councillors and MLAs and whoever else has power to put pressure on these people, but we don't seem to be getting it. Why is that? Now, for reconciliation and peace building, I think we're a wee bit sick hearing about this. It doesn't make much sense without truth, justice or accountability. The past cannot be pushed under the carpet. Today's peace is only superficial, and the truth must always be told. Do you know, Golda Meir was a wise woman. One of her quotes states, "You cannot negotiate peace with someone who has come to kill you." I think that is very apt. I'll just finish off with a few more quotations here I think are very appropriate. Desmond Tutu said, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." Lois McMaster, Big Old, said, "The dead cannot cry out for justice. It is the duty of the living to do so for them." And I think that's why we must keep telling our stories and getting the truth out. An unknown quotation says, "Justice delayed is justice denied," which is true. And I'll finish off with this wee quotation about trauma. "We don't get over or move on from our trauma. We are forced to make space for it. We carry it. We learn to live with it. And sometimes we thrive in spite of it." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was a very powerful story of the terror to which I was referring, which was very visible when I was in Kingsmill and you showed me where you'd lived, just around there. Also bravery, specifically the determination, and you stayed with your mother in the house for a good while before having to move. Also of restraint, a story of restraint, and a remarkable story of the word you used, grace. You mentioned the premeditated aspect of it, and that also reflects the scandal. If you think of a soldier, if you think of the worst wrongdoing of soldiers, not entirely was it without premeditation. There were a small number of instances where there were, but the great bulk of the contentious killings of soldiers were soldiers who made decisions in split seconds that might have been wrong, might have been a little too trigger happy in some cases. But that is entirely different from the calculated picking off and murder of which your family has suffered so grievously. Just one last thing before we move on to the next panel. I was reminded of something when you said there. Did you say your father worked for Haldane Shields? Yes. Yeah. I don't want it to sound like North Down, because nowhere was exempt from the Troubles. I have school friends who, small number, but who had a father killed. And also a family friend of Haldane Shields, John Haldane, was murdered in his office in 1990 in the summer. And that was today when I drove here down the T-Ban Road. I don't remember exactly where the T-Ban massacre was, but I know I was in the general area. That was for working with the security forces, and John Haldane was murdered for working with the supplying the security forces at the age of 50. And again, I come back to this point. Terror, right? You start bloody all these rotating aspects of terror, all of which failed until they started bombing London, but that's another story. Talking about bombs, our next panel speaker is Claire Hayes, whose brother Alan Radford was murdered at the age of 16 in the heinous Omagh atrocity in which 29 people and 2 unborn twins were killed. And it was, I don't need to say anything about Omagh, but another thing that we might touch on in the question and answer is Omagh is an example of the legacy scandal, because there are 2 things with Omagh that are done to minimise it. The first is to imply its dissidence, but it was in a long tradition of Republican car bombs and massacres. And the second thing is something I think you said, actually, that you feared, if I'm right about this, when the inquiry came up, that it will end up being blamed on the police. A fear of mine as well. So, Claire Hayes, thank you.
I'm trying not to look too far around me because I start babbling too much in my words. I don't prepare anything when I come to these events because I speak as I feel freely, and remember from the day that my brother was murdered and prior to that. My brother Alan was the most beautiful 16-year-old boy that you could possibly imagine. The most kind-hearted boy who done everything for his mum. My mother was a single mum, worked very hard, and on Saturdays Alan went into the town to help my mum carry the shopping home. On that particular Saturday, Alan had been babysitting the night before for a woman who had actually sadly had alcoholism. And that morning Alan went down to check on her and the children, so he actually arrived a bit later back into the house. The night before, I had went out with a friend to a disco, and I shouldn't have been home until later on into the evening time, but something made me get up and come home early that morning. Very beautiful day, sun was shining. If anybody in this room was there will know what type of a day it was. So every time I see the sun now, I'm instantly drawn back to the 15th of August, 1998. And it takes me a while to adjust to the seasons, to the change. I have to, even today, an ambulance goes past me and I jump in the car. Some days are better than others. But back to Alan. Alan was in the town with Mum that day, doing the regular shopping, but he was preparing to go to college if he didn't pass his GCSEs, which were due out on the Monday, just after the bomb. Alan wanted to be a chef. Don't know how he was going to do it because the sight of blood, he used to faint. And I was like, Alan, there's no way you're going to be able to gut a fish out or, slice meat. You're going to be on the floor. So bearing that in mind, the way my brother was brutally murdered on a street, face down, with water going over his back. Nobody with him, nobody to hold his hand. Only what I can imagine after I asked the coroner how fast did he die. Maybe up to a minute and a half. That was a minute and a half too long for me. For my brother to be there, isolated, on his own, God knows what I heard. Sadly, my mother was also injured. Alan had only left her for a brief moment to go up the street and was ushered back down the street. And the last known moments that I know of Alan was he was basically walking in a diagonal across the road right towards the bomb car. Throughout the years, I was 15 when that happened. Alan was 16. He didn't get his GCSE results on the Monday. In fact, it was me that collected them for him many months later. I was told not to go back to school, maybe take a year out. But what do? You get up, follow my mum's footsteps, and I got on with it. Very difficult task to do as a 15-year-old girl. Going back into school, being thrown back into work, people looking at me, not knowing what way to address me, and still to this day, people don't know how to address trauma, or they look at me and it's either there's that doll that never shuts her mouth about Omagh, and I will never stop talking about my brother. And it's like Jennifer said, I'm glad that there is some youth in this room tonight. It is something that is burning inside me that we need to take great focus on. We need to be dragging our children and our grandchildren with us. Education is key for them. I don't want Alan to be a number, a statistic, which he is. Like Jennifer said, without us, their memory goes. They die when we go. So we need to make sure that everybody in this room is making a conscious effort to bring their children along, start educating them. Alan, on his 40th anniversary, or 40th birthday, sorry, I got an award put into Omagh High School, and it's called Alan Against Adversity. That award I wanted for people who face adversity on their own, in silence, whether it's a child who's coming to school, who's in foster care, whether it's somebody who doesn't particularly achieve academically, but needs to be recognised for just sometimes just being a good human. We need more of that. I don't really want to talk too much about the day of that horror on the street, because recently, as you know, the public inquiry has started and I had to do a piece, sit down and write about my brother Alan. I've talked numerous times over the years about Alan, but sitting with pen to paper broke me, and my husband will tell you how much that broke me. We're almost 28 years past Alan's murder. And in those 28 years, I can hand on heart say, from a 15-year-old girl, I'm still very much that 15-year-old girl. Yes, my age is growing, but I'm still back on the 15th of August 1998, where my world stopped. I take great comfort in speaking with Alan. He's left me with great encouragement through songs. And there's days a song will come on and I'll just know that's him. So when I was asked to speak at this, I was like, right, I don't like writing things down, I'll just go with the flow. I'll let Alan guide me through it. So I started writing down, and back in the very early days after Alan was murdered, my way of trying to express, bearing in mind my mother had been injured and I was at home then with my mum, my own, and all I wanted to do was escape. And I felt guilty for leaving mum in the house on her own. So I used to write poetry. And I thought, right, I'll have a wee word of Alan here and I'll write some things down. And that's what I want to leave you with tonight. I want to focus on injustice. So I've called it My Injustice. I was asked to speak of injustice, the injustice of losing you. I even searched for the definition, but it doesn't explain it like I do. I'll let you see my injustice. I'll make it simple and plain. It's that smiling boy in a yellow jumper beside me in a frame. I'll show you my injustice. Just look around this room. We sit here in the present with our loved ones taken too soon. I'll share my experience of injustice. I'll simply put it to you. There's no justification in being blown to bits or death by gunshot wounds. I heard the world cry over, no stone be left unturned. Yet again we met injustice, and nothing has been learned. The injustice that keeps on giving, that keeps breeding in this land. They want us to keep silent, to conform to the agreement plan. They teach our children history, a polished history of the world's past, yet not a word be spoken of our loved ones is too graphic for the class. I'll explain what injustice feels like is something which I know well. It's the daily upon awakening, realising you're still in hell. The renewed returning grief that never grows thin. It's the injustice of having to live, yet slowly dying within. It's the never-ending battle, no matter where you go. It's learning to live and survive each day with family, friend and foe. It's the injustice and the no justice that's really hard to take. It's the swapping bombs for briefcases with smiles and solid handshakes. It's the promise of peace times, they sold it to us well. Yet just 4 months later, They bombed my town and threw us back to hell. They say I'm only bitter. Forgive, it's time to move on. Those men who left the bomb that day just got the location wrong. My injustice is a feeling no words could ever define. It's the wounds, the hurt and the broken hearts that doesn't heal with time. Thank you, but I do want to reiterate on that point. Please educate your children. Please. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Claire. That was a more powerful testimony, and you talk about bitterness the wrong way around. No, not bitter at all. The wretches, and we know who they were. That's bitterness. Your story is one of them. Your brother had a dedicated younger sister, and it's another story of bravery and stoicism and also compassion. I was very struck by you being sensitive to the suffering of people who've experienced different forms of adversity. So thank you for that. And we'll maybe talk about Oma in the questions and answers. There'll be a lot to get through. The last speaker, Reverend Canon Alan Irwin. I spoke about him having written things for the newsletter and been involved in so much more than that, and legacy. And the appalling story, Alan, of you having your father, Thomas, I think the anniversary is tomorrow, and your uncle Fred murdered as well, and just extraordinary stuff and quite appalling. Alan Irwin.
Can I thank you for that, and I want to thank Jennifer and Claire for all that they have shared, and just to say that my brother's here, his wife at the front, and I have Fred's, one of Fred's son and daughters is sitting down here as well in the congregation here this afternoon or this evening, just to make you aware that they are here, along with numerous other cousins as well. I'm not going to say too much in relation to my father, other than the night he was on duty the night before he was shot. There was a debriefing, and there was a great earnestness in making him aware that there was a threat, though the powers that be would tell you there was a threat on all security force personnel, but there seemed to be a great deal of earnestness towards my father on that occasion. On that night in question, and it's only later as you start to dig a little deeper into what is going on that you start to hear some things in relation to that. We knew at the time when Ivan Anderson came to the house to break the news, and Ivan, as you know, was murdered just over a year later. When another service member came in who served along with my father, said to him, he says, "You know rightly what had taken place," and he said, "That's a discussion for a later stage." That was our conversation on the morning of the murder, of what might happen and where possibly it would happen. And the thought was at that stage Carrickmore, because Carrickmore was where, under the guidance of the water service at that time, he had a full hour to spend between the maintenance of that sewage plant plus his lunch, not thinking that it would be Mountfield on close proximity to the main road there at Cookstown. But I'm going to, just Mountfield outside Oma, just 7 miles, but just more or less to say that. But I'm here to really talk about hope, I suppose, in some sense. And I wanted to share some thoughts, and really there's a few verses from Psalm 146, 3-5. "Do not put your trust in princes, nor in a son of man, in whom there is no help. His spirit departs, he returns to his earth. In that very day his plans perish. Happy is he who is the God of Jacob for his help, whose hope is in the Lord his God." And I know that sometimes we live in an era where the truthfulness and relevancy of God's inspired word is taken more for granted and maybe dismissed as completely irrelevant. And one would say that it has no bearing on our lives of individuals today. But those few verses from that psalm have a great deal of relevancy and resonate with many of us who are innocent victims of terrorism, and others whom the church and state have failed, betrayed, been dismissive of, and lacked empathy with our lived experiences. And I suppose, like you all here, been brought up to respect the rule of law, the law of the land, and I know even at times we probably pushed the boundaries more than we should have, but we had to accept the consequences of your words and actions. And I can tell you, when we pushed the boundaries of Dad's law, when he shouted twice, you'd better stop, because the next time it was the cane you got. There was no such thing as mollycoddling as we do now with young people. And after the horrific news of being told that a member of your family has been murdered, and once you move slowly beyond the initial aftermath, the words that you heard begin to emerge again. And this is the thing that has sickened me down through the years, is the political leaders' open condemnation of we will do all in our power to catch the terrorists responsible. And we leave the security forces of leaving no stone unturned, and time, as we have seen in many instances, have delivered nothing substantive. It was clear in the passage of time our trust, our hope was greatly misplaced, as were our loyalties in that justice would prevail. We were not naive. We knew the pressures on our security forces, still engaging with the constant onslaught of terrorist activities and murderous acts. It was, you might be forgiven in saying, a drip-feed type of genocide over countless years. The countless failed legacy proposals to deal with terrorism of our past and present, to deliver justice for the innocent, has been merely a piecemeal solution. The contemptible comment regularly held, "We're here to listen," didn't deliver fruitful results. It has just simply fell on deaf ears. And if I had £1 for every time I have heard government officials say, "and politicians were here to listen," I would be a very rich man. Because all they do is plough on their own agenda. They continue to give the perpetrators equivalence with the innocent. But there's nobody on the higher echelons of power who are actually listening. And I know that I have sat with Jennifer across the table with the Northern Ireland office in London, among others, arguing our point. And it's just a tick box exercise and out the door. I have sat with others and challenged the Simon Coveney. And I've been down with the DFA down in the south. And you listen to them guys lying through their teeth time and time again. But we're not as easy duped as many in wider society are. Isaiah 2:20 says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." Many in society either ignored or accepted such equivalence, defending it because of the supposed peace process. The disintegration of what is right and the sanitizing of what is wrong continues after concession to terrorists is given. And you all know the royal prerogatives of mercy, the on-the-run letters, the freedom to stand for government, to sit on policing boards, their apologists free to eulogise and glorify their terrorists and atrocities. And we are asked, what do you want, is the usual question is still posed of those of us who meet with these government officials. The simple answer is justice. And you would have thought those elected to positions of government would know what justice meant. And it seems to be very complicated for them to understand. To use our laws to fairly judge others in righting the wrongs and punishing crime. The HET was meant to be an attempt to give families answers but raised more questions than it answered. In practice it sounded good but sadly lacked substance, as many reports contained inaccuracies. Their key aim was only to answer the questions that families posed, and hopefully that would address their concerns and we would just basically go away. But we need to know who planned, identified and pulled the trigger or planted the bomb. Such evidence was usually lacking. And those of us who engaged with the police ombudsman, we didn't fare any better. Because I did engage with the police ombudsman. And for almost 8 years, they didn't do anything. Their usual excuse once or twice a year, they didn't have the resources or their funding, and it dragged on and no outcome. Legacy Investigation Branch took over where the HET left off, but long delays for families and lack of answers seldom has delivered either. Now the hope seems to rest with the ICRIR for delivering for families, yet at the outset marred by its then planned immunity for terrorists. So we're not stupid. Terrorists already have their immunity. When you voted yes in the 1998, you give them their immunity. And they have their immunity in the south. Clearly evident. So let's not beat about the bush in this. And that ICRIR is going now almost 2 years, and there's still nothing in respect of cases being solved, answered or prosecutions in the offering. And this call for witnesses seems at times to me superficial, as does the expectation as those who carried out the attacks will have a crisis of conscience and will spill the beans, as they say, on their crimes. And I do pray that God will convict their hearts and they will have a crisis of conscience. But I think they're too delved in as the devil's disciples. It'll take a lot of prayer to change their ways. And even ICRIR wants questions from the families. Yes, we have the questions, but we want to know who did it, who's done the shooting, the bombing, who planned it, why, what action will be taken to hold them to account, that justice will be done. And as I've said, successive Irish government's failures around the legacy of terrorism, their supposed promises that amounted to nothing substantial. We only have to know that the inquiry into Oma is going to be delayed because they still haven't their legislation through Parliament or through the Dáil, and even the legislation they're putting through the Dáil, I think you would get better in the nursery school of children than what they're attempting to put through, because it's just a foist. They have no intentions of giving anything to anyone of any substance. And I have to say, the stench of hypocrisy that emanates from them is stifling at best. There's a Pontius Pilate actions will, I hope, be called to account. And I do hope, and we need to be pressing our government to take the Irish government to court. But not just the Irish government, the European Union needs to take them to court as a member of the European Union, because they're failing in their obligations under their ECHR that they seem to be using at will. The violations in giving, as Ben has alluded to, succor to terrorists, and the failures to extradite and carry out legacy investigations. And the unpalpable truth is our lived experience of terrorism has become the lucrative cash cow for many other people at our expense. That's a hard pill to swallow. And I know I'm meant to speak on hope. And the picture I portrayed is all the hallmarks of hopelessness. And it's what many innocent families have lived with since the murder of Most Foul was instigated against family members. Just the other night, we were watching the Gerry Adams in his media press release out in front of a mural of Bobby Sands to stick it in the face to the innocent victims of terrorism. This was a victory. You may as well say the two-fingered salute to those of us who've lost. And I had one of my parishioners, I think her husband was there that night, and my mother's living with vascular dementia and Alzheimer's. And she said, "That's a bad brute. And he's still here," she says. And last night I was going out to our Easter vestry meeting. And she says, "You need to watch yourself, that old brute's still about." She still has those thoughts even now. But there seems to be in our government and society that Sinn Féin and the IRA are a protected species, and you cannot do anything or say anything that might harm them. And I would say to you this, that the biggest problem we have today is they're living in fear. This excuse that we will go back to where it was before. Fear runs our government when it comes to Sinn Féin and all of those. And it does sicken them. We've failed and failed and failed again. We've been left to that our situation is of importance to others, and particularly those that the state is the apparent perpetrator. And sadly, that hasn't been helped by our own politicians. They've equally failed miserably in this area too, because the 10% attributed to the security forces, they need to quantify that, as Ben does numerous times, that the majority of those were legal. There was nothing illegal about what the security forces did, maybe from one or two. But they don't quantify that. They just quote these things off. There's very few of our politicians could rhyme off the atrocities one after the other. But we have those who stood up for us and fought our corner, even though, like us themselves, were up against it, their proverbial brick wall. Or if interviewed or prevented or spoken over as they seek to articulate the truth. And I know that that has been the case on many. It's an opportunity that Ben has had on television. If you've watched, as I say, the comedy shows when they're on, when he tries to articulate and put forward the truth, then the interviewers would always talk over him or try and move it on because it wasn't what they wanted. And I know we need to educate. Claire has said it. We need to educate. We need to get involved, ensuring that the truth of terrorism, and not just left to us, but every single one of you in colleges, universities, no portraying the protagonist as peacemakers. And I just want, in closing, just briefly to say thank you to the newsletter. It's reporting the truth on the legacy scandals and on the weakness of government. And I want to thank Ben and his other staff, and they've had to deal with me numerous times over the years, and also to SEF and other groups that are very much aligned with the same aims and objectives. And who knows, maybe the ICR may give us some answers. We wait and see. But we still have a higher hope, and that is God. And then one day true justice will prevail, and there'll be no more evil. The righteous will be rewarded, and we will have that true and lasting peace. It will become a blessed reality. Jeremiah 17:7 says, "Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord and whose hope is the Lord." Because I think that's all we have in the present, is to hope in the Lord.
Thank you, Alan. Another story of dedication, the dedication of the three panellists tonight to their loved ones really shines through. And I'm very struck by that at the Victims of Terrorism Day this year. Two of the people who were in the room had witnessed things under the age of 5. And I wondered, I didn't know whether maybe one way of responding to that was blotting out the memory, remembering clearly seeing somebody being killed under the age of 5. unimaginable trauma. There's so much trauma, and the uplifting thing for me, you talk about hope, is the keeping alive of the memory. And the possibility that there are people who feel guilt. I don't doubt that there are some, not many, but some. I talked to a playwright who was linked to a murder of a judge, actually. And he said that when he had met murderers and terrorists and had talked to them, he said when they got empathy, if they did, which the brutes, to use the word, don't, then they were in a very, very bad place. You talked about empty worlds. Something I'm very struck by is the ritualistic condemnation. And also the people, I think you were alluding to churchmen, who are very forgiving of terrorists. Now, that is, I don't have the strong faith that many of you have here, although I'm increasingly attracted to it. So I listened with particular interest to that, and I understand why a churchman might be understanding and forgiveness and look for hope and show understanding to people who get involved in terrorism. But what about then showing commensurate sympathy and understanding with the victims? And that falls down very, very badly if you're going to do one. And the last few things I say just before we hand over to the questions. You mentioned the HET. I'll just very briefly bring it back to Edgar Graham, the lawyer murdered at Queen's University. His sister, who's been very traumatised by his murder, she talked about getting his bloodied clothes back and stuff, and her parents never recovering. She got a letter from the HET, and the HET did some good things, saying that there was no further investigation. If you contrast that with the many millions of pounds spent on the appalling murder of Pat Finucane, another lawyer, inquiry after inquiry, and there's going to be a public inquiry. That's a very lopsided legacy process. But again, we'll come to this in the questions. So we're going to throw it open to the floor. If you want to speak, raise your hand. When you do speak, if you get called, please give your name. And if you have a particular connection to legacy or something, just briefly identify that as well, if you could. And Kenny's got the microphone, so.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, it's an honour to have you here because you are one that does speak out, and we do buy the newsletter at times to see what you have to say. But tonight is the Irwin Families Night, and when I look around here and see a lot of the ex-UDR, police reserve, B specials, all the rest, most of us had helped to carry some of our comrades to their grave. But what I did want to say, I could go on all night, but I don't. The night before Comrade Irwin was murdered, in F Company 6 UDR, we had 6 platoons. The Fintona platoon was the one that I was attached to and represent. At some stages, some of the men from other platoons would help us out if we needed it. The night before, Thomas, or Tommy as we always called him, was out on patrol with myself and some of the other members of the platoon. And sometime on during the night, I got a radio message that to bring the men to the ops room before we stood them down, which we did. And Captain A.I.K. Anderson was actually the duty officer on that occasion. He was murdered himself, as you've seen on that later, a gentleman and the second commandant in 6 UDR, or in F Company. But anyway, he said that they had some, I suppose the things they can say and things they can't say, but they knew that the next day there was going to be highly likely that a murder would be carried out. And I can still remember he pointed, Tommy, you're one of the likely ones. yes, that was, there was quite a few of them. In fact, I think someone might be here tonight that were there. But anyway, Tommy went home, and I can assure you that they shot an unarmed man because he didn't want to take his gun home with him. And that is what my mother, when she was 90, could have done what the people that call themselves an army done. She could have shot you in the back of the head or in the back. And how they're classed as an army is beyond me. I think that army should be changed to animals, because animals wouldn't even do the like, I suppose. It'd be disgracing them. But I just wanted to point out I have been speaking to Canon Irwin, and I just wanted to point out that I would probably be one of the last people that are speaking to him on that occasion, and he definitely was unarmed. And it was sad to see the next morning. I don't know whether the authorities were covering up somebody that had tipped them off, or what the reason they had, because I know on different occasions they have went about it in a different way. In some cases, the military police have guarded the people till they had to be asked to remove themselves because they were only showing them up. And I know another case where 3 men were on their way to murder another school bus driver, and the car broke down, and I could name the 3 of them, but I suppose Jerry Adams wasn't in the IRA, so probably they weren't.
Thank you very much for that memory, such an important memory. And it reminds me of, there's so many stories, and our panelists have alluded to this as well, and I keep finding out more. And I've been at the newsletter 20 years. Killings I didn't know about or didn't know much about. Do you want to say anything, Alan, in response to that?
Really just to say that Bert and I had a discussion just recently. I was over speaking at a banner mission, discussed it, but I suppose I picked it up whenever the news was broke in our house that there was something that they weren't prepared to tell or weren't prepared to say, and sort of really kept quiet. And I would say it wasn't till Operation Banner came to an end and the UDR was stood down that the men who served maybe felt a little bit more open to be able to share. And I think maybe now they're more open to share because of the way the whole legacy has been going at the present time, that they're disgusted. Because the question that we have, and I'm sure many others, what was it all for? What was it all for?
And I also think that I wish more people would come forward. I wish more retired judges and civil servants and soldiers and ex-UDR and I was talking to the police 10 days ago, and they've such important. The police, UDR are totally demonised, and the police are very calculated targets of a legacy attack. I don't have time to get into that because we want to hear from the floor, and I think there's a woman here who wants to ask a question or speak. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you very much. My name's Rosemary Barton, and while I'm a Fermanagh person, I did represent this area at one stage on Fermanagh District Council, and I'm still representing an area in Fermanagh District Council. Just like to say thank you very much to all our speakers tonight. You have been very brave in everything you said, and I'm very humbled to be here tonight, listening to you and your thoughts. I do live in a border area too, as Mrs. Jordan knows. I was brought up in that border area, and I'm very conscious of the difficult decision you made to speak here tonight, and can I thank you for it. Just to say, in my past life, I was a former teacher. I taught in a post-primary school for over 30 years. Never did I see a politician. You spoke tonight about wanting to educate our young people in the past what has gone on. In those 30 years, I never seen a politician invited into a school. It was the controlled sector I taught in, and never seen a politician in that school, in any school, or knowing of any politician to come into schools. So I'm wondering, have you any solutions or have you any thoughts in how we can encourage politicians to go into schools, speak to the EA authority, perhaps get them more often into the political and history classes to try and educate our young people? Thank you.
And Claire or Jennifer, do either of you want to say anything on that?
Well, for me, this needs to come from a victim's perspective. If we go down a political route, we're only doing the same of the same. And that's where we don't want to be. We'll tell it exactly how it is. It's our truth. This is exactly what happened. There is no fluffiness around it, and we'll tell it as it is. When I was at a group discussion, so shall we say a group discussion, yeah. And we had quite from universities to Catholic mainstream schools and integrated schools. And the most adversity that we held, well I did in particular, was from the integrated college. I myself had a daughter who went to the integrated college here in Omagh, and I had to pull her out in third year. My daughter could not stand up and say that she was Northern Irish. She came home with ashes on her head, and she was left feeling like she couldn't mention anything to do with Alan's murder. And Maya has stayed that way. She doesn't tread too much on the toes when it comes to Alan. She kind of stays in the middle ground. Whereas I have a 14-year-old boy who's at Omagh High School. Now I took Maya out of integrated college and I put her into Omagh High School. Why? Great ethos, and it's where I went. And I can tell you, Miss Gibson sitting down there, one person that I admire is yourself. Miss Quigley, now that she's gone, I'm devastated. I would like the rules, I like the regulation, the respect that the school held. And that I was part of that school, Alan was part of that school, and there was many other members of that school who was murdered. The children in that school need to be educated about that plaque that sits on the entranceway into Omagh High School. My son Lewis gets very annoyed that Alan's award be awarded out and there's no indication of who Alan is. That hurts my child deeply. He is going to have to carry this pathway forward after I'm gone. So it's something that we want to address, but we need to come at it from a victim's perspective. We can't come at it from a political one. To be honest, I wouldn't want to see a politician going into the school, because the children that I know are already being taught so much hate within their own four walls in home that it's getting to a point where we need to re-educate their own parents. So that's my response into it, that we come from a victim's perspective. We've got TikTok, condense it down, make it short, make it sweet, and get their attention.
And just another thing I'd say about that, very briefly. I went to a school in Hollywood and then a school in East Belfast, and they were culturally very British, and I kind of realised it at the time, but I was taught soft nationalist propaganda. So this is a very, very deep problem. Kenny, what I'd say, if I know people often don't want to ask questions, but I know that in a room full of this, you're bursting with thoughts. So what I would say is, even if anybody wants us to discuss briefly, because we want to get as many in from the floor, a topic, just the UDR or the RUC or an area or a particular thing, please raise your hand. We have somebody here.
Sammy Heenan's my name. I can empathise with the panel. My own father was murdered in front of me when I was 12 years old. I must commend the panellists this evening for their courage, for their commitment to share their story, and for the emotion in which they shared it. I'm sure everybody will concur here this evening. Everybody found it very difficult to hear that, but there's stories that need to be told. Claire did touch upon the schools, and I would concur with what she said about Omagh High School. It is a school very much to the fore in remembrance and remembering their past pupils. They have a very positive narrative around it, and they're not ashamed of it. But the one thing that I do feel, and I know Alan and I and a group of us went out to Rwanda, is this aspect of forgiveness, which therapeutic forgiveness, I feel as if we cannot move in that direction, somehow we're an obstacle and we're a barrier to progress within Northern Ireland. I know as I get older, I can't help it, but I am feeling more angry about the revisionism and the rewriting of history which we are encountering from the Republican movement. And we have to intensify our case and our cause to confront that. So how do you folks feel now, 2026? What is the dominant emotion which you feel? Can any of you have any resemblance of forgiveness, or is it a case still where the more we see from the people who caused grief and heartache, the more we see them being dominant in our narrative, it makes healing and peace harder? How do you deal with that when you watch the Jerry Adams, as was talked about there on the news, when you see him glorifying in front of the Bobby Sands? What emotion is the most dominant that you encounter?
So, Sammy, thank you for that very important question. And your own story, which has always struck me, of being alone after your father was murdered and having to cope with that, even to get help. Another shocking story. Does anyone, I'm struck by the time, Claire, you're the most recent, I think, victim, and even in your case it's 28 years. Do any of you want to have anything about the passage of time and anger? I just as a non-victim, I feel myself getting very, very angry about events. Or whether with time, a forgiveness element. Who wants to respond to that? Or say anything at all about that? Jennifer.
Well, on the forgiveness issue, first of all, I think that really, if there's no repentance, how can there be forgiveness? The IRA hasn't come to me and said sorry to me for what they did, or they haven't told me why they done it. So why would I forgive them when they are not repenting of it? I don't want to be playing God. I am not God. If they want forgiveness, that's up to them to go to God. That's between God and man, not me. So I think unless there's repentance, there'll never be forgiveness.
I just had a thought there. We've done a lot of stories with Shane Paul O'Doherty, who's a very repentant IRA man, and there have been others, Sean O'Callaghan and so on. How do does anyone want to say, I'm curious how a victim feels about somebody like that? And I'm not talking about somebody who's trying to get a reduced sentence. I'm talking about people who decades later seem to be really remorseful. Do they anger you, or do they give you encouragement? Alan?
Sure. I suppose in my situation, anger does, I think it's more sickening, some of the stuff, but those who have come to an area of repentance and have used that time since to try and call out their colleagues or whatever they may have been, give some degree of hope. But as we know that even the vilest sinner, God will forgive, but it is God who has to forgive. But my question has been, and this is not just for the IRA, but for loyalist terrorists who find God in jail and then come to it. I often wonder, what have they done to make restitution, where possible, to the families that they have ruined, either through the murder of a loved one or through planting bombs or whatever? What restitution have they made to them? And that's one of the things that always runs in my mind in relation to that. What have they done to do that? But it is always good to see someone coming to Christ and coming to that point where they have forgiven. But we need to see the fruits of the words in action. and we need to see it being played out, and it shouldn't be for some form of glory or some form of telling their story at some event where they can get all this praise. My question would always be, what have you done to make restitution to the families? One of the things in Rwanda is the cow for peace, and that sense of bringing the perpetrator and the victim together to reconcile in some ways. And they're very clear. If there's no repentance, there's no forgiveness. And when they hand over that cow to the perpetrator, it's a recognition that that person has done wrong. And then the first calf that's born they have, and then they milk the cow and provide the milk for the other. So there's a kind of a restitution in the midst of what they've done. And a lot of their crimes, they will never be able to restore families that have been literally wiped out. So I suppose that's where I become. What are they doing? What restitution to those that have wronged?
Wow, what a thought-provoking answer. A lot of people here, and I know somebody here has a question at the back, and I just encourage you, time can disappear very quickly when there's so much fascinating stuff being said and shared. And I would encourage you, after this next question here, to think, do you have any short questions, quick-fire questions that we can answer? And Kenny at the back.
Hello, my name is Marion. I'm very proud to say that I'm an employee of SEF for the last 6 months. And I just want to commend the panel. I was really, really moved to hear your stories, Jennifer, Claire and Alan. And just going forward, I think there was two things that really struck me. The murder of Edgar Graham and the effect that that had on young Protestants in particular, who would have probably entered the field of law. So my question is, what can we do? And it touches on appealing to young people and educating our young people. What can we do going forward to encourage our young people to be ambassadors for innocent victims and to tell the true story and to keep that legacy going? Can we encourage young people into law, for example, to become the barristers to represent the cause of innocent victims? And how can we reach our young people? So I think Claire mentioned about social media. Social media is everything in a young person's life. So we need to tell the story through social media. For example, there may be other ways, but are there ways that cannot be done in a unified way?
Thank you. And Claire, you're the youngest on the panel. Do you have thoughts on that particular question?
Well, like I said, I think, especially with the bite size in TikTok, it is everywhere. My children love it. Well, there's one of them that's not allowed on it. She's only 12. Lewis, now he could hack into a bank, so he's managed to make himself an account, and he kind of got away with it for quite a while. So now he's got TikTok and he's on Facebook. What you said, that he was only on the school's Facebook because you got a special code to get on it, and then we realised, no, he's actually set up his own Facebook. But one way of educating them is, and this is what I done when it was Innocent Victims Day up in Stormont there a couple of weeks ago. I took Lewis out of school, into his uniform, and I took him up the road to Stormont. And Lewis is ASD. He gets very overwhelmed. He doesn't like big crowds. He gets very, oh, I can't believe I'm in Stormont. And he gets in through the door and he goes, Mum, how do you know your way around here? I says, Son, I've been here that many times, I've lost count. And he went into the room and he sat there, and I got Timothy Gaston and I says, look, I need you to make a point. I said, my son is here and I'm going to have a wee bit of a fight in my hands to make sure he doesn't get marked absent today at school. And true to form, I got the wee text message to say, your son was not at school today. Sent a wee email. I took my son on an educational visit. What I would like to see is a busload of pupils, and that we need a bigger venue and a bigger room in Stormont, that it can't hold the amount of children that want to come. There is nothing wrong or too gory about our history that cannot be taught. They're taught about the Holocaust, they're taught about the concentration camps, but we can't speak about what happened yards down the street from some of the schools. So we were asked, and Sammy, if I had known you were here, I would have been down to see you ages ago. I haven't seen you in so long. But we had asked, when we were speaking to all the schools that time, like what kind of age are you talking? You tell me what age they start learning about World War I and what age that they're taught about the potato famine in Ireland. Think about that. It's quite simple. 1, educate within your own four walls. Don't be afraid of the questions. Answer it with truth, honesty and integrity.
Thank you, Ben. I'll try and keep it short and sweet. Do you feel a level of responsibility or heavy weight on your shoulders, Ben, as editor probably of our leading Protestant paper, to keep that message going? Do you feel yourself that you have a weight on your shoulder?
Yes, I thank you for that. And I don't want to turn this into me or sound self-pitying, but I find it very difficult because I do get a lot of abuse for taking the position I do. And I'm also accused of raking over the past, which is not true. And I was at an event where a unionist politician said to me, who was really wanted to get involved in business, and he said, "Why are you dragging up the past?" And I felt really bad about this, because this was a man who's trying to make his best. He wants Northern Ireland to be an optimistic place. He wants to flourish in business. He's trying to be entrepreneurial. And he thinks that I'm dragging people into the past. No, no, no. When I joined the newsletter in 2007, there wasn't actually, in fact, victims were too forgotten, I'm sorry to say. It is Republican liars and terrorists, and I don't say this lightly or to be inflammatory or anything like that. I've watched this for decades. And it's getting worse. That's why we do it, and it is a big responsibility. And thank you for that. I hope we'll continue to do it. It's outside of my control, but as long as I'm editor, we will. Kenny, has anyone got another very short question like this that I can put to the panel?
Ben, just a wee short question, and thanks very much to the panel, for Claire and the rest of them, Jennifer and Alan, for speaking up tonight. It's difficult. There's a lot of emotions and all the rest of it in it. I can verify with that. The one question that I have is, we went to Rwanda, and one of the things that we seen there was that genocide could have happened here in Northern Ireland only for the security forces, both the RUC, UDR and regular army. And at the minute, they're being trailed through the muck as being some arm of loyalist terrorism and that. And it's so wrong. And that's what we feel now, the glorification of what's going on, and then sort of our fathers who served, and a lot of people here that served, now will go into the history books as if they were part of the problem here, rather than securing the future for everyone.
I'm not going to answer that because my view isn't clear. I've spoken enough. Claire, you've spoken, for example, about how the Omar inquiry will turn into a thing against the police, which is a very serious scandal. Anything briefly any of you want to say about that specific problem, about the turning on the truth of its head of the security forces?
Just briefly to say that I've just read a book recently. You think I should remember the title, but the newsletter covered it, Jeff Sloan, I think. So I bought the book. Covered the 1920s, 85 years later, Operation Banner. And the operational codes in the 1920s are the same operational codes that are used now in the present day in Operation Banner. There is corruption within our civil service. There was then in the 20s, and the same again, that seeks to demonise the military, the police, the UDR, because that ensures, and let me assure you this, retired colonel, he's long since passed, made it very clear that the IRA were defeated in 72 and 73, and something turned on its head at that time. And I have no doubt, after reading that book, the operational codes came back into to move that the military should be demonised at all costs.
Yes, thank you for that. And I have one last question, relaying your question in a specific form to Claire. Unless, Jennifer, there's something else you want to say. But briefly, Claire, you did make this powerful point about you fear that the public inquiry will turn against the RUC. My fear as well. From what you've seen of the inquiry, do you think do you still have that fear?
Well, I want to be very clear about my view, my own personal view on the inquiry. It's flawed from the outset because we're not going after the Irish government. Now, it was Michael Gallagher and co, a couple other families, that took this action. The action's here, so I'm all in because I'm Alan's sister. And there's nothing where his name's going to be used that I am not going to be part of. So I'm going to be dragged through it. What I can tell you is our innocent men and women who were on the street that day are going to be trailed, and I mean trailed, through the mud. I feared it from the outset, and I already know what the outcome is going to be, and this was before I had any meetings to do with the inquiry team or my own legal team. There's certain things that I can't touch on because I've signed the agreement, but I can tell you this. The Irish government is thick in it. The IRA runs across the border into the sanctuary of the Republic. They were 40 minutes north of the border. There was a scout car in place. Anybody knows Oma Street on a Saturday back then, you could not get parked. Not a couple of weeks before children were going back to school. Wasn't going to happen. Scout car in place. Men were across the border for 40 minutes and skipped back across. What's happened? Absolutely nothing. What are they doing? Nothing. Like was said before, appeasement. Appeasement for the terrorists, and victims continue to be victimised. It is going to turn into a complete and utter mess, and I fear, and I want to put it out there, that I value every single personnel that was on the street that day, no matter what they done. My older brother was carting bodies back and forth for hours because he was asked by a policeman to do so. There was very little police personnel on the street. There's a lot I could say, but at the minute I can't. But it is going to be exactly what I feared.
And thank you, Claire. And I end on the point that I made at the beginning, the packed room. That's what gives me encouragement. I also spoke months ago at an Orange Hall in Pomeroy, and it was a full room, and these things give me a lot of hope that the attempt to terrorise people out of areas was not very successful. It was somewhat successful in some areas, but to a significant extent it wasn't. And that is what gives me hope. So, thank you for coming, and if we could give a round of applause to our remarkable panellists.
Okay, everyone, I'm conscious the time is motoring on, and we do want you to stay for some fellowship after the meeting tonight, and you'll be going through those doors in the middle there and round the table, and then please come back to your seats thereafter. But firstly, I want to say, and Alan, in some ways people would say, drew the short straw in terms of speaking on the issue of hope. And sometimes it does seem that we are merely filled with hopelessness. But I have to say, this table tonight is an example of hope. Because you have the editor of a newspaper who could walk a different road, play a populist line, and perhaps excel further within the industry. But he's standing by what's right. And sometimes, folks in the audience, please get out and buy the newsletter, because the circulation numbers are not what they should be. And it's running on a shoestring budget. So if I can make that appeal, Ben hasn't done it tonight, but I'll make it. Back it, support it, because if it's gone, then you will see what voice you have. Can I also say in regards to our panellists tonight, and I've known them all for a long number of years, it wasn't very many years ago, Jennifer Jordan, you wouldn't be sitting here. But you kind of got cajoled and bullied into it the first time. And once she did so, then that was it. And when she speaks on behalf of those 6 loved ones who were butchered in a campaign of ethnic genocide in the South Armagh, South Down area. And you bring a credit to them, Jennifer, because you do it in a manner as well. There's a humility in how you do it. You're not hate-filled. There's no sense of revenge. But there is a palpable and justified righteous anger. Righteous anger is not a bad thing. If it ceases within the society, then we need to be concerned. Claire, as well, and I've known Claire many years as well, and Claire's enthusiasm and energy around this youth-based issue is something that I see as very much a joint legacy with Alan Clare. And I want to give some hope around all of this. Schools are accepting of this message. We have reached into around 20 odd schools in the last 2.5, 3 years, and no one has turned us down to come in and to engage with pupils. And it comes down to resources. You could do it literally every day of the week, but a very small number of people are having to be spread very, very thinly around all of this. And we will try to do things better in that regard. There's issues around TikTok and trying to move for the modern era. We have a YouTube channel recently launched. TikTok is the next step and has to move. But in terms of school curricula, does anybody in this hall know that next year the Northern Ireland Troubles will become part of the core curriculum in the Republic of Ireland? So we've been engaging with the education chiefs in the Republic around this matter, and that they cannot develop a curricula minus the experience of people at this table, innocent victims at large, or it will be a particularly jaundiced approach taken. And we need to do that north side of the border as well, and to insist that there is a requirement for our young people to engage with these issues. That's a huge body of work. In SAFE, we hope to establish a youth council within the next number of months to bring forward our young people. And there are young people who are very concerned about these issues and who want to see them driven forward. But I put a challenge as well to each of you in this room. Your families, your sons and daughters, and in some cases your grandchildren, you have got to encourage them to come along to these events and to other events, to become activists, not spectators. Because if you don't, then it dies with you. And does anybody want to consider that? That's a responsibility for everybody. We spoke last week to Gerry Adams and the collapse of that particular case. And the truth of it all is this, folks. A huge degree of the responsibility falls on all of our shoulders. Because guess what? There isn't a slush fund of finance sitting there as an assurity for a case like that in order to have it progress to its conclusion. 3 individuals were faced with a huge bill upon them. A case was being taken on behalf of many others also. And we need to understand that if we don't put our hands in our own pockets, those who are comfortable in life and who care about these issues, show it by your commitment financially. Because I put it to you that if it were a case where there were members of the Provisional IRA concerned, I think we would know what would happen. The money would be put up and there would be no concern whatsoever for the claimants. So that's another lesson that we need to learn. Alan, I have to say, gives a huge amount of contribution to our group, to SAFE. He's the chair of the Advocacy Support Committee. And Alan didn't want tonight to to be a focus upon his own father. And that says something about Alan and his family. The issue for him is the concern. He has to deal with his own personal grief and have his own personal walk. But he's concerned about how it fits within the wider space. And that is why tonight's event, for me, is a positive event. It's an event that brings honour to your dad, Alan, because it's about what do we do about all of this. Gurning isn't enough. Getting angry when the radio plays, when the TV's on, when those column inches you're reading them, doesn't change anything, but activism does. And I would say to any of you in the room here, some of you will sit on boards of governors. Some of you hold positions within the community and voluntary sector. Start trying to be the enablers to bring in these people, to bring in others, and to have that exposure and connect with young people. I want to also give you some encouragement of an initiative that will be happening over the next number of months. There will be a group of victims and survivors from both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland who are connected to our network. And they will go on a victims roadshow-based event across the Republic of Ireland. And they will bring to communities across the Republic of Ireland the message of their experiences. Something that hasn't been done before. Because if we believe that we're going to make any inroad into Irish government thinking, then we somehow have got to penetrate through with the populace of that nation. And if we don't, we are going nowhere with sound bites around the Irish need to do the right thing. It isn't going to happen. Because we have a UK government who does legacy like the game of cricket, and we have an Irish government who does legacy like a cage fighter. There's only one victor in all of that. So tonight, I just want to pay tribute to these three special individuals, but also to Ben. And I'm very conscious within this room, there are many of you who have been directly impacted by these issues. This room is full of many bereaved people this night, and others who have had many colleagues murdered. And look at it. The next generation is critical if you want to rescue the narrative and soul of this nation, if you care about it. Because there is a juggernaut against us. But what these folks possess is the unadulterated truth. And I am encouraged that in the last 10 years, the Jennifers, the Claires, the Allens, and so many others have found their voice and are speaking that truth. Let's lift them up, and let's stop the petty jealousies also that exist sometimes within the innocent victims community. We're all working for the one common cause, and that's standing by what happened, those grievous happenings that were never ever justified. Can finish just also by thanking the district here for coming on board with this event and for all it does around the issue of remembrance. Because it's those events and small kindnesses throughout the years to families that actually matter. Not the big shows, but the care and consideration. The understandings that there's points in the year when these folks are going to find things very difficult. Around birthdays, Mother's Day, Father's Day, all of those events that so many others may take for granted. There's an ache and pain within many who have been impacted by this terror. So thank you one and all, and please do stay for some refreshments. And I would encourage you to continue to come to these type of events in the future and use your voice. Don't come merely as spectators and go home and say that was a great night, that was a good discussion. If that's what happens, then it's all in vain. Be activists and go away and learn what it is you can do to stand these issues up and push it forward. Thank you.
The tea, as Kenny says, is going to be served and it's ready to roll. But just before we do, we'll just close with a prayer just and give thanks just for that. Just, Father God, we acknowledge all that we have contributed here tonight. We acknowledge that much of what we said will indeed stir up memories, create heartache. Maybe just in those instances we would ask for your perfect healing to speak into every heart and mind and soul at this time. Be with each and every one, Lord, and we just pray that your blessing and you would grant them each a safe travel home again to their respective places, and that they would, with your guidance, be able to stand for the truth, not just of the things that have happened in our past, but of the truth of the faith that we have that enables us to meet each day. And we thank you now for the refreshments, Lord, and we ask for your blessing upon it and our continual fellowship throughout the remainder of this time together. In Jesus' name, amen.